Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 24th of June, and I want to start off by saying, wow, what a day it's really been. This is one of the craziest days in the entire war, and there were so many twists and turns in the situation, because I was keeping track of it live. If you were on Twitter, you probably saw that I was writing a lot of stuff and that I was keeping track of everything. But yeah, now I'm going to try to compile everything that's occurred today, talk about the resolution to the feud between the Wagner Group and the Russian government, and where we go from here, including some movements by the Ukrainians. Because remember, while everything's going on between the Wagner Group in Rostov and to the north, Voronezh, reaching Moscow, the Ukrainians were still obviously going about their counteroffensive in Zaporozhye and also conducting counterattacks around Bakhmut, so we're going to get into that as well. But of course, we got to discuss the resolution to the conflict. And I did a previous video, and in my last video, I talked about how the entire situation was unfolding with the Wagner Group and their columns advancing throughout the M4 highway. M4 highway, it is an important highway that connects Moscow to Rostov and also to the Donbass. So it's very important that it remain under control and be under a stable situation in order to continue shipments into Ukraine. And basically, I was talking about all of the advances from Rostov by the Wagner Group, and then for the north along the M4 highway, which I'm going over right now. And you can see how the Wagner Group, they continue to advance first to Pavlovsk, all the way to Boturlinovka, where there's an airfield, by the way, even further north to Voronezh, where there's another airfield, and the Wagner Group did not have a solid control over the city of Voronezh at any point, but they did have control over the nearby highway, and they did have control over certain sections of the city. There were some light clashes between certain units. I think they might have been local police or border guards or Rosgvardia and the Wagner Group soldiers, and there was actually an oil field on fire in Voronezh. So there was some clashes in this direction, not that much though. And again, yeah, there's a airport over here that has significant resources. But then the Wagner Group, they continued even further to the north, all the way up to Horsk, Kolodetsky with T-90s and BMP-2s. But they continued even further, crossing the Don River all the way to the town of Yelets. They were in Lipetsk Oblast, but I don't know whether they actually reached the city of Lipetsk itself. But there were a lot of traffic closures in this direction, and the advance here was so fast that I don't really think that the Wagner Group really had a singular stable force in many of these major cities, because that was never the point of their attempt at trying to force Putin's hand or trying to gain power. That was never part of their plan, because time is not on the Wagner Group's side. It was not on their side, because the Russians, they have the air force, they have the capabilities to strike these advanced columns. So what the Wagner Group wanted to do is a very rapid advance all the way to Moscow. And so that's what they were doing until the negotiations occurred, but then they continued advancing to the north. And really, they were stopped before they entered Moscow Oblast, although there is a bit of confusion as to whether they were stopped 200 kilometers away from Moscow Oblast, which would be a bit further to the south, like around Tula, or even further south around Novomoskov, or how to pronounce that city name, or if they were stopped 92 kilometers away from the city of Moscow, which would be very, very close to the Oka River. And the Oka River would be one of the final natural barriers separating the Wagner Group and their forces from the city of Moscow itself. And I spent a good portion of the morning trying to map out all the crossings and all of the areas where the Russian forces, and when I say Russian forces, I mean Ministry of Defense forces, where they were setting up checkpoints and mining different bridges and preparing for them to be blown up, because you can see there's multiple crossings that Wagner would have used, and those would be the gateways into the city of Moscow itself. That never came into fruition though, because around 10 hours ago, I would say, as of the recording of this video, and that would be like 9 p.m., 8 p.m. Moscow time, when I'm trying to think of it, when I'm adding the numbers. Around that time, the Wagner columns stopped advancing, and there was rumors of negotiations which ended up being correct following an announcement by the Belarusian President Lukashenko. So we can thank him for that. But Lukashenko, he says that he was able to negotiate a resolution between Wagner and Russia, and said that Prigozhin agreed to withdraw his columns from Russia, especially on the M4 highway, and de-escalate the entire situation. And so due to all this, Prigozhin also confirmed what Lukashenko was saying by saying himself that to avoid bloodshed, that the Wagner Group had agreed to return their convoys of about 25,000 men and 5,000 men going in the direction of Moscow back to their different field bases in eastern Ukraine. So due to Prigozhin's decision to stop the Wagner advance, there were some conditions that the Russians had to meet and that are currently being parsed out and discussed by both parties, and that could include leadership changes to the Russian Ministry of Defense. And so we should all be keeping an eye out in the coming days and weeks for what happens to Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, and Valery Gerasimov, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Both of them have constantly been lambasted by Prigozhin, and they were really made out to be the two main bad guys by Prigozhin in this entire situation. Not really Putin, although you could say that by Prigozhin going after those two, that he was going after Putin indirectly, because Putin appointed them, and they are very loyal to Putin as well, both of them in the military cadre. And so you could say that he was trying to drive a wedge there. Well, either way, now it seems like there may be some change to the MOD, and I think that Prigozhin would like for there to be a more hardliner in charge. Maybe that could be Surovikin, because previously Surovikin had very good relations with Prigozhin. They worked very well together in Bakhmut in October until January, so maybe something could go on over there. But so far we have not seen any changes to the leadership, so we're going to have to wait and see if that ends up manifesting. So that'll be interesting. Also, there will be security guarantees for the Wagner Group, so the Russian Ministry of Defense will be obligated to protect Prigozhin and his core following in the MOD. And apparently Prigozhin is supposed to be moving to Belarus. He's going to be on exile there. And probably some of his allies, his loyal allies within Wagner, will be joining him there. There's some reports, I can't confirm them, that the Wagner Group will have some of their assets moved to Belarus to border and guard the border with Ukraine. And so that might be a new role for them in the future instead of fighting in Ukraine itself. So that's just another thing to be added. Another condition is that there was the fact that the Federal Security Service dropped the criminal case and the arrest warrant for armed rebellion against Prigozhin. And so Prigozhin and the rest of the Wagner members, they have received legal immunity from the entire situation, so they won't be held accountable for whatever illegal activity they committed during these past 2 days. And due to this resolution, there's a lot of members of Wagner that I've seen on Telegram that are really pissed off at Prigozhin's decision. And they seem to be way more ideologically motivated, even more hardline than Prigozhin himself. But it's important to remember that Prigozhin is probably doing this for his own self-interest, and that doesn't care as much about the entire cause of making sure that Russia defeats Ukraine. I'm sure he also wants Russia to defeat Ukraine, but I think that he cares the most about his own interest and the interest of his mercenary group and his own bottom line. So that comes into conflict with a lot of these die-hard pro-Russia, very fanatically pro-war, and people that have basically been criticizing Putin and the defense ministry for being not being extreme enough. Those sort of people, they're probably pissed off by this because they thought that this was their best opportunity to seize power and finally finish off Ukraine by whatever means necessary. And so a lot of those people, they are now beginning to leave Wagner, as they posted on their Telegram channels. And at the same time that the Wagner Group is leaving their positions in Russia, the National Guard, they return to their operating bases, and so that shows that the situation is under control in the minds of the Russian military and the Russian government. And something funny that happened during this entire time is that Putin sent the Chechens under Kadyrov to basically retake Rostov, because Rostov was taken over by Wagner yesterday. They had control over the key buildings, and they basically had they made the Southern Military District subordinate to them and forced them to talk to them and hold certain conversations, dialogue as their subordinates. And so what was happening is that the Chechens were sent over. They had positions on the northern and northeastern suburbs, northwestern suburbs actually, around Taganrog and around the E58 highway leading towards Rostov. But they never actually made it into Rostov during the entire ordeal because apparently there was some very large traffic, a lot of civilian traffic in the area, which bogged down their advance. And so they never actually saw combat against Wagner. And even if there wasn't even if there wasn't any sort of traffic, then they probably still wouldn't have fought Wagner just to prevent any bloodshed. But either way, they didn't really serve much of a role in this entire situation, and now the Chechens will be going home without really achieving much of anything. So that's pretty funny. But anyway, let's move on. There was a statement announced by Peskov, the press secretary of the Kremlin, where they stated that the Wagner fighters who did not partake in the rebellion that occurred over the past few days would be able to actually sign a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense. And there's not many Wagner soldiers that were not involved in this, to my knowledge, and so I don't know the numbers for that. Well, it does show that, first of all, the Russians will not suffer a large manpower shortage due to this situation. They've not lost really much of any men in this entire ordeal, and even the ones that were part of Wagner will either be signing contracts with the MOD now, or they will remain with the Wagner group, where they have the option of returning to Ukraine. Although, as I said before, maybe the core group of Wagner group troops might even go to Belarus and border and be on the border, manning the border against Ukraine. That might be another solution that has been floated. And as Wagner withdrew from Rostov on the night of the 24th, now it's the morning of the 25th in Russia, on the night of the 24th, because Rostov was really the forward base for Wagner, where they were coordinating all of their movements. It was supposed to be sort of a supply hub that connected all of the different columns, and it's also where the Southern Military District headquarters was located, which is also responsible for basically coordinating all the attacks against Ukraine. So what was happening there is that the Wagner group began to withdraw at night of the 24th, and a lot of the civilians, they were actually very pro-Wagner. Throughout the day when Wagner was controlling Rostov, these civilians, they were really ecstatic. A lot of them were cheering them on, clapping, taking photos of them, just vibing with them, sitting on tanks, taking pictures. It was actually a pretty cool scene. It was pretty funny. They were just sitting there and having fun. So when the Wagner group and their men left, a lot of the civilians were pretty saddened by that, and they were clapping for them again and whistling and cheering them on. And when the Russian police made their return back to the city of Rostov to replace the Wagner fighters, a lot of the citizens in the crowd were actually shouting, quote, shame and traitors at the police units when they returned. So that shows that in the public zeitgeist, there's a large amount of support for what Wagner stood for, and that includes turning against the Ministry of Defense and established Russian institutions due to the perceived weakness that they have. Even if the situation has been resolved now, it doesn't change the underlying feelings of a large chunk of the Russian populace that the Russian forces have been inept and unable to succeed in their objectives, especially the leadership. And so that's another thing to look out for. It's been pretty interesting. But something I would like to mention is an interesting article by the Wall Street Journal, where they reported that actually American spy agencies, they actually picked upon Prigozhin's plans in around mid-June. And so they had about 2 weeks of foresight and foreknowledge of the events that were going to transpire. And a lot of the security officials, they were very worried about whether Putin would stay in power and the implications that those would have for the nuclear arsenal. So that was their biggest concern. And U.S. officials also alleged that a key trigger for this entire situation, this entire conundrum, is that Prigozhin was very worried about a June 10th Russian Ministry of Defense order that all volunteer detachments in Ukraine would have to sign certain contracts with the government. And that includes, obviously, the Wagner PMC. And so this would clearly and severely limit Wagner's independence and their operational capabilities on their own. And so U.S. intelligence believes that this was really the final nail in the coffin, or like the straw that broke the camel's back. And they believe that Putin was actually informed of Prigozhin's plot sometime more than 24 hours before the event actually transpired. So that's very interesting coming from the American security. And it would also raise questions as to why Putin didn't do anything about the Wagner columns when they began, because he had at least 24 hours to prepare. That's a very interesting part of this, and it adds another layer of complexity as to whether Putin was aware of this beforehand, whether Putin was just simply too weak to deal with the situation, or whether Putin always intended to have a negotiated settlement and didn't want to spill any blood by launching airstrikes onto these columns, which would only further escalate the situation when he was planning to have it resolved in the first place. Because remember, Putin and Prigozhin, they actually are very good friends, and Prigozhin has really been a man that's been on the side of Putin for a long time. They go really way back to St. Petersburg when they were much younger, in the 20s, 30s. And so they have a long history. And Prigozhin, his Wagner Group, PMC, it was supported initially by the Ministry of Defense. Where did he get all its funding? When it was conducting the activities in Africa and even in Ukraine, they were getting a lot of their material support from the Ministry of Defense. And so in a way, you could say that like Putin created his own monster, unless they were able to come to a solution, which it seems like they have now. So that would sort of subside the entire situation for the time being. And something that I find to be very interesting in terms of losses is that there were a lot of Russian losses, especially in their air force. And these numbers are actually higher than some of the losses incurred by the Russians in Ukraine. And so it's pretty interesting to see the Russians inflicting losses on their own military. So here we have Oryx. They have been able to compile all of the equipment that was damaged or destroyed by Wagner and vice versa. And so I'm going to just read through it. You can see for yourself. There's 9 pieces of equipment of the Russian government forces that were destroyed. And actually it says 6 that were destroyed. 1 damaged and 2 captured, with a total of 9 being casualties. So there was 1 IL-22M, and there was also a lot of helicopters that were damaged, because a lot of these helicopters were flying over the columns. Some of them actually fired upon the columns. Others were just sort of trying to get a look at them and trying to track their movements. And so there were several incidents that I talked about in my last video and that occurred after that video of the Wagner columns firing at these helicopters, some of them being transport helicopters, others being attack helicopters, and that probably caused some casualties. So here you can see 1 Mi-8 transport helicopter, 3 Mi-MTPR electronic warfare helicopters. So 2 were destroyed and 1 was damaged. Then 1 Mi-35M attack helicopter was destroyed, and then 1 Ka-52 Alligator attack helicopter was destroyed. There was a mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle, an MRAP, that was captured by the Wagner forces, and that was a Kamaz patrol vehicle. Then in terms of infantry mobility vehicles, there was 1 Tiger M captured, and then the Wagner Group, they only suffered 1 destroyed vehicle according to publicly available information, and that is this I think this is a truck, if I'm not mistaken, the UAZ. That seems like a certain truck that is used by the military. So that's about it. Not many people died, only about 12 according to official reports from pretty major Telegram channels. It's also on Wikipedia if you check. Not to say that Wikipedia is a lie or that they are right all the time. Obviously, they do get a lot wrong, but I think it's safe to say that the 12 dead number fits in with the reports of all these helicopters being shot down, because certainly at least some of the people, if not a lot of them that were shot down, did die due to that. And so 12 Russian pilots being killed is highly likely, and so that really is the totality of the casualties. It's not very high, but nonetheless it does mean that some blood was spilled, and it's going to be hard to reconcile with that. But I think that for the sake of politics, for the time being, Putin's going to look over it. I think that, as I said before, I think that a lot of the higher-ups, a lot of the people that actually turned their backs on Putin during this entire situation, because there were a lot of lower-level officials in the military, in the Rosgvardia, in the border guard, in the police, that ended up defecting to the Wagner Group. or didn't show a sign of strength during a difficult time. A lot of them were exposed as traitors or opportunists that were just looking at who has the most power. And Putin knows who those people are. So I am very interested to see how he deals with them. There will definitely be some people in the coming weeks and months that will find themselves miraculously thrown out of windows or dying of some sort of tea poisoning. That's certainly going to happen. But the ironic thing is that it's not going to happen to the Wagner group. It's going to happen to the people that defected to them, that were a part of the Russian camp originally. But who knows, maybe in the future something will also happen to the Wagner group. But for now, the Wagner group still exists. They have been able to force Putin's hand in certain decisions, including leadership, including different reforms being done, including dropping all charges. And so, in a way, it is great for Wagner, especially because they did not suffer any casualties in the process, and they've been able to maintain their cohesiveness. It's also good for Putin because he's been able to maintain power, but it does show the weakness of the Russian internal affairs, because it's never a good look to have, columns of rogue PMCs roaming through hundreds of kilometers of highway open as if nothing is going on and with barely any pushback. That shows that there are major security concerns internally for Russia that have to be addressed, and that's really it. That it's good that the situation ended like this and that it didn't further escalate, because there was a fear that it could break out into civil war, which would be bad for everybody. I don't think that even from the Western or Ukrainian perspective, it would be a good idea, just due to the instability that it would cause for, you could argue this, but really the country, the largest nuclear arsenal and arguably second strongest military in the world, although people do dispute that now. But yeah, that's really all I have to say for today. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.